Actually, this will follow this. I just want to thank Suisheng Zhao because his paper inspired me to do a little bit of research on Midway, Atoll, and 5 other U.S. islands. Paper makes some others. I won't mention them. This is trivium, not a question. But I noticed that the U.S. has a lot of atolls that are not, by UNCLOS standards, I believe, islands. But that involves some international law that's rather complicated, I think. My real question is for both Professors Heath and Friedman, and it's about policies. What, on the basis of your papers, should the U.S. do in terms of policies for Professor Heath? I like the contrarian aspect of your paper. Asian disorder? What Asian disorder? I mean, you admit there is some, but notice that rivalry, though it has risen and it seems to be rising, is not at historic levels. Your semi-optimism is bolstered, and here I want to just quote briefly from the abstract, by a resurgence of overlapping subnational identities and loyalties, raising internal resistance to efforts by national authorities to mobilize support for costly competitions. There's a lot of domestic China evidence for that. I think it's very interesting. You talk about the majority of the population being largely disengaged, these are mostly your words, from U.S.-China rivalry, limited popular support for rivalry. But can a leadership, especially one like Xi Jinping's, very quickly, over very short time periods, reverse that and raise this national sense of rivalry? So what can the U.S. and other democratic countries, to the extent we are still that, do in policy terms to reduce the chances that China's top elite will do that? And the same question really for Ed Friedman, and that is, what can the U.S. do to reduce the sense of historic national humiliation, torture, that rightly, I think, he emphasizes?
Okay, well, thank you for your question. I'm not sure this is working here. So I ask. Can't really.
This one. No.
Thank you for the question, and I want to temper my, admit it's probably a little contrarian optimism to say, in my analysis, if you saw the little chart, I did not put the little red line, again that's kind of the mean, I did not put it at the bottom to say peace, cooperation, no problem. It's at a level where there is a risk of crisis, so I want to acknowledge that even if I'm correct, and there's great resistance to national leaders mobilizing the people for a great power war, that doesn't mean that the problems of repeated crises, tension, clashes don't go away. I think those are going to be persistent. In fact, that's kind of the norm I'm suggesting is a long-term period of sustained uncertainty, risk of a crisis, relaxation, exacerbation of tensions, but real difficulty, it's a good thing, real difficulty of escalating to a great power war due to primarily this bifurcation between elites and people and the lack of incentive for the people to support a great power war. There's very little incentive for them, from their point of view, most people, to support that. I think what this, in terms of policy implications, to me, I think what this suggests is policymakers in Washington, I'll just speak for Washington, need to conceptualize competition with China in a different way. It is, in my assessment, very difficult to try to reboot Cold War strategies or strategy of World War II, where you assume the country can mobilize enormous amounts of resources to field huge armies and militaries and contain or coerce China. A much more realistic strategy is going to be scaled down. It's going to be operating within strict constraints, financial constraints, economic constraints. I think the competition is real and needs to be carried out because we have imperatives to maintain influence and status. The technological competition has huge implications for economic growth, and it does affect the people, even though it's harder and not obvious, I think, harder for people to see how that competition affects them. It's very important, but our leaders and the experts who support them are going to have to conceptualize how do we scale competition with China in a way that is politically feasible and that controls the risk of escalation. And that's where tools like working through cyberspace, working primarily through diplomatic maneuvering, using special forces to train and equip partners, relooking security companies. Defense contractors are already becoming a big force in both China and the U.S. I could see in the future this kind of interesting, constrained competition them playing an important role somehow. So I guess that'd be my recommendation is competition with China should be conceptualized in a way different than we have approached it in the Cold War and in previous periods.
So I can't answer Professor White's question. My focus is not on the United States, it's on China. So if I may, take a couple of minutes to say something what Professor Paltiel had to say. So I think he's right in trying to understand why China doesn't have discourse power. Why doesn't Hawaii try? And talking about UNCLOS is one good way of getting at it. China here simply means the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. It doesn't really mean Chinese people or something like that. China imagines itself as being a victim state, as allied with other victim states. In reality, China is a superpower, and its interests aren't very different than American interests. So when UNCLOS comes up, China approaches UNCLOS as if it's a victim state, and it sees itself as a victim of the previous law of the seas, which was seen as benefiting the great navies of the world. First the United States, and then, first the British and then the United States. By the way, I think that's absolutely true. And so UNCLOS was supposed to be a corrective which would take power away from the great navies and give more power to countries in controlling their borders and so on. And China misunderstood that it was a great power, and it had the same interests as the United States. And so it signs up for UNCLOS and then finds UNCLOS is a pain in the ass. And if you were in Washington at the time, you were totally aware of that. It was not secret that Chinese self-identity was not serving Chinese interests. And that's very interesting. But what wins out inside of China is, I think, the great power forces. And whether they lose on the discourse power, the fighting tribe, or not, one thing my paper wants to argue that the forces making for the great power territorial expansion will continue. Now, I have no idea what the United States is supposed to do about that. I can't imagine that it's easy to go to the U.S. Congress and say we should be fighting over rocks in the South China Sea against the People's Republic of China. So I apologize, I don't have an answer to the question.
Hi, thanks so much for all of your presentations. I have two questions. The first one is how you think China's Belt and Road project fits in with the security versus economic projection equation. And from the perspective both of how the Chinese government is seeing it in reality as opposed to what it says, and how those affected those who are partnering in the Belt and Road see it. My second question is about small and medium countries particularly close to China in Southeast Asia, and the extent to which you think the formation half a century ago of ASEAN is providing any kind of counterbalance, or whether China has effectively co-opted it by giving deals to Cambodia and Myanmar, and the extent to which ASEAN could perhaps partner not just with the US, but also with the other rising power in Asia, India, even though India is well behind China at the moment.
Okay, I'll go for the second question. The first question will be answered by other panelists. About ASEAN, I think, and I think this is one of the most interesting concluding remarks in Lowe's paper, that ASEAN will want to have a country rising up against the United States, as long as the relationship between these two are not so bad as to force them to choose side. So that a moderately competitive relationship between China and the United States, or between China and Japan, is actually good, because ASEAN can tilt between the two and get economic concessions. For example, those with companies would bid for the infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asian countries can take advantage of that. But if it rises to the level of you have to choose either this side or the other side, then the countries in the middle would lose, because they would lose their bargaining position and they would be forced to be completely within one camp. So it really it's up to the degree of hostility between the two great powers. Now I would say that after the two shockwaves, the competition, the level of hostility and the rivalry between the United States and China has reached that point that a lot of countries, including Canada, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, would have to choose sides. I don't think any country, probably except Taiwan, is brave enough to take a very firm stance on this issue. So it's a matter of whether the great power competition has reached that point as to deprive the middle powers of their leeway. So that's my, yeah.
Could I just ask a quick follow-up? I guess what I was really wondering is how effective you think ASEAN has been as a bloc. I mean, China loves to do bilateral arrangements with individual small and medium countries. And the whole idea with ASEAN was, you know, we'll hang together, we should hang together or we'll hang separately. You know, there's a big power in the region. Let's work together so that we can work to defend our common interests. Has that worked?
Well, I think it has worked to a certain degree, because try to imagine that if there's no ASEAN, then what would be the picture? But it has worked only to that degree, because we all know that countries like Cambodia and Laos and so on and so forth, they are capable of sabotaging any unity statement from ASEAN against Chinese expansion into the South China Sea. So I think the existence of ASEAN plays a role in counterbalancing China, but on the other hand, it's a limited role because of the inherent nature of that organization, and also because China has taken, as you see, a bilateral approach to various ASEAN countries. I think it has been playing a very successful role in doing that. Cambodia, for example, and also any country that is, because of institutional reasons, value reasons, and so on and so forth, like military coup d'etat in Thailand, not military, anything. Anyway, it's the abnormality of the politics in those countries that would pose a problem for Western countries, probably not for Trump, but anyway, may pose a problem for Western countries to support those countries. Then those countries would find ready support from Beijing. So yes, it plays a certain role, ASEAN, but only to a certain extent.
Let me address the BRI, the One Belt One Road issue. BRI is, divided into two parts. One is land mass to Central Asia. The other is toward maritime, South Asia. This is what I think the purpose of this conference, and also I think that's what you want to get answer. And I think first of all, I want to say that BRI is welcomed by many countries for its focusing on connectivity, infrastructure construction, because there's a big deficit gap for those funding for those infrastructure in many parts of the world where the One Belt One Road is trying to go. In fact, I was in Singapore a few months ago attending a One Belt One Road conference. I was the only person in the panel to criticize the One Belt One Road. All those people from Singapore, from Cambodia, Vietnam, in Vietnam, all those countries try to grab one piece of the One Belt One Road. Having said that, I would say One Belt One Road cannot accomplish its objectives. For sure, that's what I was very critical on that. There are several problems One Belt One Road. One is that commercially it's not viable. You cannot find those enough profitable projects for such huge scale. In fact, look at China's outside investments. Most of them have not gone to One Belt One Road countries. In fact, those investments and also trade has been decreased in the last few years. And the largest South Asian countries, or One Belt One Road countries, get the One Belt One Road, the funding is Singapore. Does Singapore need those infrastructure funding? No, because Singapore is the most profitable country, most safe country for those investments. The China investment when it came to the United States in 2016 reached 70% of China outside outflow investment, but US closed that 2017. So they try to find other stable and profitable countries, not One Belt One Road countries. Second, I think the problem let's find kind of avoid those conflict of interest between China and those One Belt One Road countries, which has not been the case. China had a lot of problems with those countries, local politics, and they bring laborers to those countries, which is plenty of laborers, and so many problems in terms of the conflicts. Third problem, as we said here in the conference here, they cannot develop a shared value between China and those countries. I think Professor Pitt talked alternative. One Belt One Road, I think, is a failure, but AIIB is a successful case so far. Why? Because when AIIB has adopted existing values, the international development institutions like World Bank and AIIB, the Asian Development Bank, those kind of values. But One Belt One Road, what is One Belt One Road? It's not a multiple multinational scheme. It's a multiple bilateral agreements. These are the 100 agreements. They are all bilateral. And also China built the two calls, one in Xi'an, one in Shenzhen. One deals with maritime disputes. The other deals with land side of disputes. In China, why they don't use existing multilateral international arbitration or international courts? For those countries, they go to China, they have to speak Chinese. They have to understand Chinese law. In Shenzhen or in Xi'an, how could that work? How can that will build a multilateral scheme or alternative value system? Not at all. China cannot using Chinese tianxia or heaven system to rule this area. So that I published an article, I'm adding a journal of contemporary China, that at most, China can build a China pond in Southeast Asia, not China Lake. The Japanese tried, failed, and China cannot do that either.
Do panelists want to respond to Jeremy's discussion? We haven't seen any hands in the audience. Please feel free to respond.
We have a speaker.
Oh, we do have, okay.
Thank you. I have a question for Professor Zhao Suisheng. Thank you very much for your speech. Since 2017, since the Donald Trump presidency, the U.S. Navy has operated the 10 freedom of navigation operations in South China Sea. What is your? My question is, according to your understanding, what is the reason make the differences, how do you evaluate the effect of the operation of U.S. Navy in South China Sea to balance the China's emerging power? Thank you.
Of course, I'm not Americanist, so I don't want to speak on the American politics side. But I think this is mostly from military side. I don't think Trump is interested in the South China Sea per se. As Professor Yu said, his article talked about here geoeconomics prevails over geopolitics or geostrategic issues for the Trump administration. So the South China Sea freedom of navigation operation, I think it has been initiated mostly by I think the Tim may be in a better position from Pacificom, from those kind of military side. When Trump came to office, before that he talked a lot about China problem. He is such a transactional person. He changed overnight or changes every day. And so when he came to office, he had a conversation with Chen Ying-wen first. Then he said, I accept one China principle. Next month talking to Xi Jinping. And for first 100 days, we thought he would have some kind of navigation freedom of operation. Nothing happened. Only after the April meeting with Xi Jinping, he started first one, which I think has been requested by the military for quite a while. And then that has, for him, I could be wrong, you are in a better position to talk about that. I think he has been kind of hands-off on that issue. So I don't think those represents a strategy of the US try to fight with China in the South China Sea. My overall assessment of the Trump's administration, people in China have a lot of conspiracy theories about Trump now has tried to contain China, has a grand strategy, economic is only part of that, has a grand strategy try to contain China's rights. I don't think he has any strategy at all. Yeah, everything is just ad hoc, just case by case, and just overnight, just if he had good coffee at the morning, or have good sleep at night, or midnight, 3 o'clock, had good tweet or not. So that's what I see, that in that context, in the South China Sea, freedom navigation, I will not take that too seriously at this moment. The trade war now is almost, for him, it's gone. So that's a really funny thing here.
Yeah, I'll offer a few comments on that. I agree with Professor Zhao that President Trump himself, it is very difficult to predict exactly what he's thinking. However, I think there's pretty good evidence that below the level of the president as an individual, the U.S. government, there is a consensus that the U.S. needs to step up its competitive posture regarding China. And there's quite a bit of consistency. If you look at State Department and Department of Defense, their language about China, the agenda that they're promoting, it provides an essential context for understanding those freedom of navigation patrols. So the fact that PACOM changed its name to Indo-PACOM, right? That's part of this vision. Free and open Indo-Pacific is what the U.S. government, with or without President Trump's full understanding, that's what the U.S. government is implementing. There are a number of actions. You saw the U.S. government announce initiatives to fund infrastructure development to counter BRIs, another aspect. There's stepped up engagement with Taiwan. We heard about some examples. There's just a lot more energy and activity, I think, across the U.S. government. DoD is one symptom, these freedom of navigation patrols, but you're seeing virtually all the departments are starting to rethink and take harder line, more competitive policies regarding China.
Thank you. I'm a visiting scholar here. I actually have two questions. The first one is to Professor Heath. You talk about a strategic rivalry, but for me, this term sounds kind of interesting. I thought strategic sounds like a temporary. It's like it's for a certain purpose that you use the rivalry as a tool. But from your presentation, I feel like you were kind of describing rivalry as a condition, like a constant condition. It's like a So I really want to know that what's the meaning of rivalry in your paper? Is that like a relationship, a perspective, or it's like a tool? And the second question is actually to Professor Yu-Shan. I'm interested in the small states, they probably would change their position, right? From the sometimes they were probably more poor balancing, some are more for bandwagoning, but what's the drive for the change? From the case of Taiwan, it sounds more like a domestic condition. Is there any explanation that probably can help us to either predict or to understand? Well, I know domestic factor is kind of crucial, but is there any other things that can help us to understand why the small state has this kind of logic of changing? Is that a symmetric structure that really shaped their perspective to a certain limitation, which is described by Womack? He uses theory as well.
Thank you for your question. Regarding rivalry, I would describe it as a type of antagonistic relationship. What's the difference between rivalry and strategic rivalry? Well, rivalry in general is a relationship, antagonistic relationship between two countries. And in general, you can say there are two kinds of rivalries. There are ones over territory. Those are very common, and they are often seen among poorer countries and countries with less power. They fight and argue over territory and go back and forth. Strategic rivalry involves disputes over issues of status and position, and they can go beyond the immediate geography of either country. They can span regions or the world. So when countries are having a rivalry over issues of status, influence, position, over issues of norms, of standards, globally, regionally, that's when you start to get into a rivalry that has more of a strategic nature, and that's what I was referring to in my description.
Yeah. If I were to clarify that, so territorial rivalry is zero-sum, whereas other forms of rivalry are not necessarily zero-sum. They can be multiple-sum, or they can be any kind of sum, and that's I think that Heath is actually pointed to something relatively correct, and that it's the template of the Cold War is absolutely the wrong template to talk about Sino-American rivalry today, simply because it just doesn't work. The two countries. Mr. Pence will find out that it doesn't work. The United States cannot decouple from China, and China cannot decouple from the United States in the way that the Soviet Union and the United States were decoupled during the Cold War. And any effort to do so will hurt each side as much as it hurts the other.
Let me answer Chungcho's question. I talked about two logics. First one is the really small countries' positioning between two great powers is actually foreign policy. So in that context, the medium small country will decide its position vis-a-vis China and the United States based on what its leaders think is best for its national interest. Obviously, different political leaders will come up with different political and economic calculations. So the position may shift, but generally speaking, I would say that to be the hedging partner of the United States serves the interest of many of those countries. And it is because the balance of power between the United States and China changes to the point where they reach power transition that they change their behaviors towards the middle powers. And the middle powers would have to adjust their positions in response to the great powers' different posturing. So I talk about shock group 1, shock group 2, and so this can be properly discussed within the realm of international relations. In the case of Taiwan, the situation is different because the position of Taiwan between the two is not determined by the overall national structural situation, but rather by who wins domestic political election and what is the national identity that a particular winning party has. So there's a lack of flexibility, but then you may still have a lot of flip-flops in Taiwan's posturing, and that's not because of the changing international environment, but because of the changing domestic environment, because Taiwan's voters happen to choose another political party, and that political party will bring with it a different national identity, historiography, the whole batch of this. So it has to do with this socio-political cleavage in Taiwan. It's not just a foreign policy issue. So we have entirely different logics.
A research scholar at UC Berkeley. I just would like to have a very general question regarding to territorial disputes in South China Sea. And as we all know, no matter whether it's 11 dash line or 9 dash line, in my humble opinion, I feel like the PRC and the ROC in Taiwan, they all share the same historical disputes in this regard. So as we all know, we're talking about the UNCLOS, which was established in 1982. However, because those kind of historical disputes happened before that, so is there any theoretical assumptions are able to help us understand these historical disputes happening before the UNCLOS, so that we can have a better solution or a better understanding, not only for Taiwan or China, but also for other countries surrounding this area? The second question I would like to ask is about is for Professor Yu-Shan, and as we all know, right now there is a opinion talking about signing a peaceful agreement between Taiwan and China, and even though I don't think it is feasible in the near future, but I still feel like whether or not in terms of hedging strategy, it might be a strategic option when Taiwan kind of sitting between these two great powers, China and the United States. Thank you.
If you want, on the first question, I could answer it if you like. Before UNCLOS, there was no exclusive economic zone. It didn't exist. Okay? So if we're talking about exclusive economic zones, that is clearly a product of UNCLOS. Okay? So, and UNCLOS doesn't decide necessarily the sovereignty disputes, but the question of the consequences of sovereignty over features of the sea, that's a matter for UNCLOS only. Here's a clarification also. The United States has not ratified UNCLOS, so that the United States cannot claim against China that it's violating it because the United States has not ratified it. That's why the United States mostly talks about the freedom of navigation, which has been part of the American history since the beginning of the American Republic, since John Paul Jones and the shores of Tripoli. This is an American thing. And it's not necessarily shared by other countries, but it's an American thing. And that's why it doesn't necessarily, it may be part of a hedging strategy by Asian countries, but it's not necessarily endorsed by Asian countries. That's a simple clarification.
A few points on this question here. For China joining the UN cause, I heard story, and you said victim feeling. In fact, that the case was China signed because US did not sign. And so whatever US did not do, it's good for China to do. That's at that time. Then they discovered they made a mistake. US did not sign. US has a reason why US did not want to sign. So the problem for China is that they understand now US is not in the position China is today, have to subject to UN clause, arbitration or whatever. US now, although the US has not ratified that, but US is in a much more flexible position, talking about all those issues. So in that context, next point here is that the question here is that, do we have a solution? Both ROC and the PRC have all claimed this, and also you mentioned that is not the historical claim, it's most recent claim, although can trace back to the 1947 map. But why is a new claim? Because China has become more powerful. When China becomes more powerful, China has a capacity to support that claim. The claim is not new. What new is that China has the coercive power behind the claim. That's what we have seen in the last 10 years. In that context, what have the solution? Might make right. Unfortunately, that's the law. The rule is not the UN clause. It's what kind of powers you have, which is what we don't, is not what we want to see, but unfortunately, that's what we have seen. The region has moved toward. Very, very sad.
Let me answer the question about whether it is possible or good to have a peaceful agreement across the Taiwan Strait. I think obviously everyone loves peace, but this is a very sensitive issue because nowadays I think a peaceful agreement with China would suggest at least giving up any attempt towards Taiwan independence. That would be the minimum condition for China to agree to sign any peaceful agreement with Taiwan. That in itself would be okay for the KMT, but it would be totally unacceptable for the DPP. So with half of the population vehemently opposed that kind of agreement, it would be very difficult for any government in Taiwan to initiate or to accept a proposal from Beijing on that. I remember vividly that in 1998 there was a kind of proposal on intermediate agreement, that is to freeze the status quo, and then the United States would come up as a guarantor of that agreement for 50 years. But that didn't succeed because obviously China considered that as an intervention, serious intervention into domestic politics of China. So today when we talk about 和平协议, peace agreement, I remember Ma Ying-jeou mentioned that. And that was in the run-up to the 2012 presidential election. And he got burned and a lot of criticism. And so he laid a lot of conditions on top of that original proposal, saying that it has to be ratified by a referendum and so on and so forth. So I don't think the political situation in Taiwan is in favor of signing this agreement. But because of the great tension, a lot of people in Taiwan does desire peace. So it will pop up every here and there, every now and then. But I don't think the political conditions are right for that.
That is a minor thing. I'll raise with Sam and Jeremy after the panel.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I concur with Professor Wu's conceptualization of the shockwave 1 and shockwave 2, and also I agree that it needs to be traced back to the world financial crisis in 2008. That I actually see this very drastic change in posture of the Chinese government after the 2008. Then the micro adjustment is that the turning point might be not exactly 2008, but 2009 and 2010. But particularly 2010, when the Chinese government is very confident and it was very apparent that their stimulus worked. And then while U.S. is still struggling, having Tim Geithner and Hillary Clinton traveling to China to convince the Chinese government continue to buy U.S. Treasury bonds and all that. So this kind of conception that U.S. and the U.S. dollar and everything else come with it has been damaged and is in decline, and it is trying to turn to be assertive and to be cocky and to be aggressive, and I think you're very right in designating this turning point in China's position and gesture. But 10 years after, in retrospect, can we say that actually at that time China made a bad judgment, or it is a wrong judgment? Because at least maybe it is too early to tell, but at least on the surface, and you see that the U.S. dollar strength has gained back, and U.S. Treasury bonds has been in demand more than ever, and U.S. economy, at least in terms of financial markets and every other kind of superficial standard, is back. And while China's economy is actually getting into more and more apparent trouble, and so in retrospect, can we, and also the China assertive stance after the global financial crisis invoked a huge pushback from the U.S. and some of the U.S. allies as well. And you see what happened in Malaysia regarding Belt and Road and all this situation. And definitely the Xi Jinping's domestic enemy in China might want to make the case that Xi Jinping overplayed and misjudged. But I would like to hear all of us opinion on it. In retrospect, it's 10 years now from the financial crisis. Did Chinese government make a misjudgment about the turning of tide regarding U.S.-China balance of power? Thank you.
So if I may, there are a couple of issues on the table which I'd love to add a couple of words about. One is the might makes right. I mean, that's a view of the world, a realist view of the world, in which it's a self-help world. And so if you take that view, which I'm always willing to take, a view of the world, it's worth remembering that China decided to take the Paracel Islands in 1974, right after the United States in 73 decided to leave. I mean, you talk about two people at peace, and China in 1988 decided to take the Spratly Island, or a significant number, killing a lot of Vietnamese in so doing, commemorated annually in, it's a long history of might making right, but as everybody agrees, China has become more mighty, and there are therefore more things it can do with its might. And as a good question before asked, it's hard to see ASEAN doing anything about that. Vietnam has basically been left alone, and Vietnam cannot count on ASEAN. The interesting, meaning I don't know the answer to what I'm about to say, question is Japan's reaching out to India, and Vietnam being interested in both India and Japan, neither of which care much about human rights records. I don't think the United States cares much, but they care much less. And so that makes them easier partners, as Russia is still an easier partner for Vietnam. In terms of how far China can go, is there anything to what is called this horizontal or potential horizontal alliance in China having the might to do what it believes is right? I don't know the answer to that question, but Chinese leaders are very aware that this is going, this is happening. They very much don't like that, and the Vietnamese are very scared of offending China too much. It's a very clear fact. I mean, Vietnamese are really in a very difficult situation, and much more attention might be paid to the Vietnamese tension. So small and medium countries have other options than just the strategic triangle. It's very wrong to look at the Indo-Pacific and treat it as if it's a China-centered area. It never was a China-centered area, and I agree with Professor Zhao, it's never going to be a China-centered area because there are too many other players who have very deep national identities, are not about to subjugate themselves to China. So there's a lot of open questions. I want to end with the economic question, because Dr. Heath, I think, began with a very interesting point, which we should pay much more attention to. What does it mean to say that for the major powers it's now a post-industrial world? The reason why it's such an interesting question is the East Asian, Japanese, neo-mercantile development state was developed for the purpose of industrialization. And we live in a post-industrial world. And America could get along with China while it was losing industrial jobs to China, despite how Donald Trump talks about it. But in the post-industrial world, where technology and knowledge matters so much more, and technology is, China becomes seen as a predatory power. Not so easy to deal with. And that's not just the United States. It's seen the same way in Korea, it's seen the same, South Korea obviously, seen the same way all over Europe, especially Germany, which is totally worried about this Chinese predatory behavior, and even Japan. So the consequences of the post-industrial policy for the future of conflict and crisis is a very serious issue. It is clearly much more difficult to get along with China following neo-mercantilist policies in a post-industrial world. I don't know where that takes us, but it doesn't sound like a peace direction for me. I don't know the future, as I said many, many times. I still believe, as I said at the beginning, I think the highest probability is China wins. But there really are so many of these forces which are increasingly war-prone, in which China does not have many allies, a point that Professor Zhao makes quite brilliant in his paper. And it leads to tremendous uncertainties about how China acts in the future, especially for this national identity issue. Because if China doesn't push, you have the danger of being seen inside of Chinese politics as weak, as soft, as selling out to the Americans, as a traitor. You have to walk inside, therefore, Chinese politics to figure out what's going to happen. By the way, this goes back to the Belt and Road Initiative. Belt and Road Initiative is not just a Chinese attempt to create an alternative world economy with China as the center. It's also very domestically an effort to keep state-owned enterprises going, because that's the domestic base of power of the ruling group, and they're the ones who make the money on it. The joke line is that it's a win-win policy. First, the state-owned enterprises win on jobs, parts, and so on, and then the Chinese banks win when they have to, the side that took the loan has to pay back the loans and can't pay it back, and they can get all sorts of other kinds of things. So again, sticking with Professor Zhao on this, there are lots of contradictions increasingly sitting here, which do not necessarily make for a happy future. When China begins its economic going out policy, it has the great advantage that the late Qing and the Republic of China were very weak regimes. And so they didn't do anything bad to anybody because they were weak. And therefore, they had no natural enemies anywhere in the world. And they were very welcome. They were very, very welcome. But now, you have a few decades of dealing with a very strong China. And that isn't the same as the weak China that you thought you were dealing with when you began. The contradictions grow. And I mean, your questions are all, I thought, I don't know the answers to your questions. I thought they were all great questions, and that's you put a wonderful agenda, which we should all worry about. I'm happy not to be able to answer your question, but sometimes questions are where it's at, and not knowing the answer is a very important thing. So I thank you for your questions.
Let me respond to Professor Huang's question was China making a mistake 2009, 2010 to turn to more confident or overconfidence and more aggressive. There are, as you know better than I do, because you have written such wonderful books, Why China Will Not Rule the World, which I think is a very good book. Everybody should read it. And there are periodical debates within China about if they made mistakes. When they started turning more confident was when the financial crisis really hit America. A lot of people at that time really thought America was gone. I was in Beijing in 2010. I was so shocked. Those scholars, they debated, should we rescue America? When they said to purchase American securities, which is a commercial activity, but for the Chinese, some people in China, in Beijing, they thought it was a political action. Because we purchase the US securities, we support the US, we are saving US. So US should be grateful. They thought US should be grateful to follow China's instruction, not to sell arms to Taiwan, for example, not to meet Dalai Lama. That's why Jin Tanrong in Beijing, you can see, US now depends on China more than China depends on US. So that kind of a confidence was unprecedented. And, but the US came back, and in a few years, I think there are a debate about if China was overconfident. Some people like Suisheng Zhao, you may know better, in Renmin University, he wrote that he called 战略透支, strategic overdrafting, or overreach, overdrafting. But that kind of views, for quite a while, did not get mainstream. A Central Party school, what's his name, that he criticized so much when Bell One wrote, and it was eventually silenced. All these views were silenced up until the Trump came to office. And at first, they were not sure what was going to happen. But the trade war really was a waking up call for many people in China, if China overstepped. The ZTE's sanction was a big shock for them. Before that, we all know, what's his name, Tsinghua, talk about China, GDP has a... Yeah, 2015, 2016, at time, these were so popular. China already overpassed the US, and China is #1 on so many aspects. Xi Jinping really liked those views. Xi Jinping liked those views. Even Yan Xuetong, talk about Yan Xuetong. Yan Xuetong's view has been changing. I really become more respect to Yan Xuetong, because even he criticized the Xi Jinping's policy was 外交大跃进, the foreign policy gradually forward. Even these people became concerned. Before that, when Yan Xuetong tried to advise Hu Jintao about big power diplomacy, Hu Jintao did not take it. Then Xi Jinping came over, not only took it, but far beyond big power diplomacy. So Yan Xuetong, for these people, they cannot follow up. So there were some concerns, but these trade war and the U.S. sanctions upon China, the technologies wake up call. And I think there are more and more people inside of China have been at least quietly thinking if they are overreached, overextended. But I don't think Xi Jinping accepts that. And so when test at this moment, we'll see the Liu He's position, because Liu He has been in the forefront of negotiation. A lot of criticism about Liu He. Sitting in the White House in the front of the Trump, just like Trump's subordinate. And so he even spoke English totally wrong. 50 billion ton of a day.
how could he try to please Americans? He is criticized as a Li Hongzhang, China Li Hongzhang. So we'll see if his position will be maintained. That's a good test if this type of overreach, overextension argument will stand.
I'd like to respond a little bit. I completely agree with Sam's opinion. But I think there probably is a deeper reason for China to make that decision. It has to do with Xi Jinping's regional weak position. As a general secretary, very few people actually knew him, and he didn't have any concrete contributions to the country. His selection was done behind the doors, and it's widely expected that he would be even weaker than Hu Jintao, because from Mao to Deng to Jiang to Hu and to Xi, lightweight, unknown person. But if he really wants to grab political power, and I know that there has been a lot of difficulty he would have to encounter and overcome in order to get the position of General Secretary, he needs to establish himself. So internally, he used these, corruption, cracking down on corruption, and externally, he whipped up the Chinese dream. So I think it's integrally, inherently connected with Xi Jinping's personal project, and I think it backfired. And Shi Yinhong also mentioned this in a conference in Taiwan, that we should keep our profile low. We shouldn't awake the United States. And our strategy today is to bring them back to that semi-dormant situation so that we can grow fast and they won't be alerted. And so that's what he suggested. And I think he is right. But the problem is whether the lion can be brought back to the cage.
I agree with both of these things, but all these issues came to a head last July in Beidaihe. And leading up to Beidaihe, Xi Jinping was under great criticism for overconfidence. The campaign against Huanggang that was public was basically a campaign against Xi Jinping. And there was a lot of criticism of arrogance. But what happened? Xi Jinping came back at Beidaihe with two things. First, the fundamental bottom line was that the United States wants to contain China. His liberal opposition could not respond to that. Number two, the only person who can negotiate with Trump over the trade war is Xi Jinping. The liberal opposition had nothing to respond to that. So he turned the entire thing around from being in a losing position in early July to coming back strongly in beginning of August, because he's the only one who can solve the problem with the United States. And the liberals just simply faded at that point. And so what was, as you said, a weak position, he turned into a strong position.
Even conspiracy. Let me give a conspiracy theory. I was in Beijing at that time. I asked quite a few people for the rumors that 2 weeks, what's going on. One theory I was really shocked was Xi like Mao Zedong tried to harm those people who tried to oppose him. So he just pretended he was weak. He pretended there was a problem. Exactly. Then he found out those people, we punched those people. That's quite a few people in Beijing told me that story. I was shocked. Exactly.
We've had a very, very energetic and stimulating discussion. And we welcome you back here at 1:30 to continue the discussion. Yeah.